Of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Good morning and welcome to the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. I'm NASA's Sandra Jones, and we're bringing you live coverage from Mission Control Houston of the upcoming Outbound Trajectory Correction Burn, or OTC-1 burn, following the historic launch of the Space Launch System from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida just hours ago. Today, we're in the White Flight Control Room, just across the hall from where you usually see us in the International Space Station Flight Control Room. The White Flight Control Room has been used before during some space station missions and during missions of Boeing's Starliner. Previously, this room was used for space shuttle missions and was also renovated in 2014 to support our use with the Artemis program. So, speaking of Artemis, earlier today, the Space Launch System blasted off from Pad 39B at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida at 12:47 a.m. Central, 1:47 a.m. Eastern. Following liftoff, solar arrays were deployed, translunar injection took place, and ICPS separation occurred. Since then, Orion has been in a coast phase. So let's take a quick look at a replay of that spectacular launch happening just hours ago.
The vehicle at 128 miles per hour. Hearing good control on the roll from teams in Mission Control Houston. All good calls so far. Now 30 seconds into the flight of Artemis I. First milestone will be for the vehicle to pass through max Q at about 1 minute and 9 seconds into launch. This is the greatest period of atmospheric force on the rocket. SLS now traveling 607 miles per hour. Maximum thrust. Quiet here in the loops in Mission Control. The 4 core stage engines are throttling down ahead of passing through max Q.
And there you saw it, that beautiful launch in the wee hours of the morning with SLS lighting up the Florida Space Coast. Now, on your screen today, you see today's flight director, Rick LeBrode, who stepped in and is leading the team now, following Judd Freeling, who led the team during the ascent portion of the Space Launch System. Now, during liftoff, SLS produced 8.8 million pounds of thrust, propelling Orion toward what will be more than a 1 million mile journey to the moon and beyond in an elliptical orbit before heading back to Earth. Now that Orion is on the way to the moon following translunar injection, the next major milestone is the Outbound Trajectory Correction, or OTC-1 burn. This burn will fine-tune Orion's path to the moon and will perform a critical checkout of the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS engine, which is the main engine on the European Service Module. The outbound leg of the Artemis I mission is the portion between translunar injection and distant retrograde orbit insertion, which will take place later in the mission. This outbound trip will take several days, during which time engineers will evaluate the spacecraft's system. And following the outbound leg, Orion will fly about 80 nautical miles above the surface of the moon at its very closest approach, and then we'll use the moon's gravitational force to propel Orion into a distant retrograde orbit, traveling about 40,000 miles past the moon in this orbit, and this distance is actually 30,000 miles farther than the previous record set during Apollo 13, and the farthest in space any spacecraft built for humans has ever flown. But before we get to the moon, we need to have the critical checkout of the OTC, which will check out the Orbital Maneuvering System OMS engine. So to give us an overview of the OTC-1 burn, let's take a look at this video overview using the moon board.
All right, now let's talk about OTC-1, outbound trajectory correction number 1. So at this point, we've done our translunar injection, we're on our way to the moon. And to get there, we're gonna fine tune our path. We're gonna make a couple of different burns just to make sure we're targeting the right direction. Now the first one is this OTC-1 burn, and really this is a critical test of that large orbital maneuvering system engine that's right here in the aft part of the Orion service module. That's really what's going to be doing our big pushing maneuvers, and it's critical for those flybys, the powered flybys of the moon, both the one that allows us to get to distant retrograde orbit and the one that comes home. Additionally, we have these auxiliary thrusters around the bottom. We have 8 of these that can provide some additional push to help out with this orbital maneuvering system engine. But OTC-1 is coming up. We'll likely make a number of these burns on our way out to the moon, and all that sets us up for essentially this slingshot that we see here before we get to the outbound power flyby. You can see that engine igniting here. Testing it on this burn is going to be really critical to making sure that it works there, and that's what's going to allow us to get into our nice stable orbit around the moon, where we can really test Orion out, put it through its paces. So coming up, OTC-1, the first in many burns using that European service module on this Artemis I mission.
And to talk a little bit more about that OTC burn that we do have upcoming, I have a very special guest joining me today. This is Brant Gast. He is a prop flight controller here in Mission Control. So thank you so much for joining me today. This has to be a really exciting moment for you.
Oh, it is. It's years worth of work. It's just a great thing to see we're off the ground in space.
Absolutely. It was so exciting to see that launch earlier. So as we look ahead, can you talk just a little bit about that OTC burn, what it is, what the purpose of it is?
Sure thing. So it really has 2 purposes. So the first one being that we are going to do a trajectory correction. So there we're going to correct dispersions or errors that we've gotten from, going off of ICPS or just being in deep space, effectively figuring out where we're supposed to be versus where we are. Second thing, as was mentioned, is checking out the OMS, the Orbital Maneuvering System engine. As a prop, that's very exciting. That's going to be the first time that we test out that big engine.
Great. And so what are some of the other major burns that will happen throughout this mission? Because this is really this first checkout of that main engine like you discussed, but we know there's going to be other burns that take place throughout Orion's mission to the moon and back home.
Yep, exactly right. There's 4 more burns that we'll do on the OMS. The first one is the OPF burn. That's the outbound power flyby. As you mentioned, it goes really close to the moon and essentially slingshot us into the distant retrograde orbit, but we don't get there just yet. Then we have the DRI. That's the insertion burn to get into the DRL. That burn will essentially put us in that elliptical orbit around the moon. We then have a couple of days, weeks, where we can test out all the systems. Then we have the DRD, so now we can depart from the DRL, put us back on the way home, and then the RPF, the return power flyby, essentially mirrors the OPF. So that way we come back, slingshot again, puts us right back on the way home.
That is definitely exciting, and even more exciting because we'll be on the air to cover many of those burns throughout the mission. So my very last question for you is, can you talk a little bit about your role as a prop during these burns and some of the things that your console team will be monitoring and looking for?
Sure. So just in general, flight controllers are there to make sure that the burn goes off well, or just in general that we get where we're supposed to go. For a prop, it's very exciting. As I mentioned, we're testing out our hardware. We are the owners of the OMS. Everything that we see from the pressurization system, the feed lines, the propellant itself, and then the thrusters. You know, this is kind of our first big test of the system. So we're going to look at things like pressures, temperatures, everything that we know, hey, here's what our system is supposed to look like. We'll see that, and then we can coordinate with other consoles like the GNCs, the FIDOs, see if they got the answers that they wanted, and then obviously we coordinate with the flight director, and hopefully in a couple minutes here we'll say everything was good to go.
Yep, very exciting indeed. We're about 21 minutes away from OTC-1, so I'll let you get back to it. I know you have some exciting work to do ahead of that burn, but thank you so much, Brant, for joining me, and good luck on that burn.
Excellent. Thank you very much for having me.
So we are now closing in on the 20-minute mark to that OTC-1 burn. Now, the OTC-1 burn, as Brant mentioned, includes a checkout of the orbital maneuvering system engine. The OMS engine is the main engine on the European service module and is located on the bottom of the service module. And so as you can see in this graphic here, on the very bottom of Orion is that larger engine. That is the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS engine. This engine is built by Aerojet Rocketdyne and is the main engine, as I've mentioned, on the European service module, which provides the primary propulsion for Orion's major in-space maneuvers as it travels around the moon. And this engine provides about 6,000 pounds of thrust and is enabled to steer the spacecraft. That engine is actually on its first mission as part of Artemis I, of course, but is a repurposed Space Shuttle Orbital Maneuvering System engine that has flown in space before. The engine flying today on Artemis I flew on 19 Space Shuttle flights, beginning with STS-41G in October of 1984 and ending with STS-112 in October of 2002. And you can also see a few other engines around the OMS engine. Some of those are the auxiliary engines. There are 8 auxiliary engines. They are located on the bottom of the service module in 4 sets of 2. These provide about 100 pounds of thrust each and can provide steering during burns by pulsing on and off. There's also 24 smaller engines grouped into 6 pods which provide attitude control. They can be fired individually as needed to move the spacecraft in different directions or rotate in any position. So in total, the service module has 33 engines in all. Now, as we are less than 20 minutes away from the OTC-1 burn today, we did hear the flight director give a go, no-go poll for today's burn, and the team pulled go. Everything looking good ahead of this critical checkout of the Orbital Maneuvering System engine. Now, this burn will be relatively short, lasting about 16 seconds long. But the OMS engine can fire for as long as 16 minutes for certain burns. And we are hearing that the solar arrays on Orion are maneuvering into the correct position ahead of the burn upcoming in about 17 minutes from now. At this hour, we are now 7 hours and 28 minutes since Orion lifted off, and Orion is 40,695 miles away from Earth and 181,000 miles away from the Moon. As Orion continues its journey to the Moon as part of a 25-day mission to test out critical components as part of the Artemis I mission, let's take a quick look at a mission overview of what is to come throughout this mission.
Welcome to the moon board. We got this just in time for the first mission in Artemis, Artemis I, so let me use it now to take you through. As always, we're going to start off with a launch. In this case, 4 RS-25 engines ignite, 2 solid rocket boosters sending SLS and Orion skyward. On the way uphill, a couple of jettison events, things coming off of the rocket. One of the most visual will be these 2 solid rocket boosters coming off about 2 minutes into the flight after all of their propellant's gone. We also have 3 fairings protecting Orion on the way uphill, as well as the launch abort system that will come off. Now, after we get through all of the propellant in that giant core stage, we'll hear MECO, main engine cutoff. It will drop away, turning propulsion over to this, the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, or ICPS. It's going to make its first maneuver to raise up the lowest part of our orbit around Earth, really put us in a nice circular path around our planet. And while we're in Earth orbit, we can check out Orion, make sure its systems are functioning as we expect before we commit to sending it to the Moon. That happens here, the trans-lunar injection, to a 20-minute firing of this ICPS upper stage. And what that's designed to do is really give Orion enough energy to get out of low Earth orbit and make its way to the Moon. Shortly after that, the ICPS will separate. Its job pushing Orion is done. It has a couple of secondary payloads in here, some CubeSats that it'll deploy, ultimately sending itself on a path around the Moon before it escapes and goes into orbit around the Sun. Meanwhile, Orion, though, continues on its journey. It'll make some correction burns as it fine-tunes its path towards our lunar neighbor before we get into all the exciting stuff up close. We'll dip in for a 60 nautical mile flyby of the lunar surface using the engines on the European Service Module to push us around and into distant retrograde orbit, or DRO. That's this dotted line that you can see up here. This is really where we're going to learn about Orion while we fly around the Moon, about 38,000 miles off the lunar surface. And we call it retrograde as the Moon is heading in that direction. Orion will be heading in this one, opposite retrograde. Now, after we're done in that orbit, it'll be time to come home. We'll execute a maneuver to exit, do another flyby close to the lunar surface that commits us to coming home and fine-tuning our path towards the atmosphere. We'll make any correction burns on our way back as necessary before it's time to re-enter the atmosphere. Now, before that can happen, we'll have a spacecraft separation event. The service module, its job is done. It breaks away, ends up burning up in the atmosphere after carrying Orion to the Moon and back. What this does is reveal the heat shield, the large structure on the base of Orion. Testing this is our #1 goal for the Artemis I flight, because when we come back from the Moon, we're going to be moving at 25,000 miles an hour. That's 8,000 miles an hour faster than when you come home from the International Space Station. And what that's going to cause is this to heat up to about 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's half the temperature if you were standing on the surface of the sun. So things will be very hot, but that heat shield does its job to protect the Orion capsule, which will be bringing our astronauts home at the end of these future missions. After we're through that fiery re-entry, parachutes deploy, Orion splashes down in the ocean. We'll have a U.S. Navy ship standing by with recovery personnel to pick Orion up out of the water and bring it in to the first flight in the Artemis program.
And there was an overview of what is to come and a little bit of what has already happened in the mission so far. Again, we lifted off from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida about 7.5 hours ago. And at this hour, we are nearing less than 10 minutes away from the OTC-1 burn. That OTC-1 burn includes a checkout of the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS engine. And this OMS engine is the main engine on the European service module, located on the very bottom of the service module. This burn is slated to last about 30 seconds long. And as we approach the OTC-1 burn less than 10 minutes from now, Orion is maneuvering into the proper attitude in preparation for this burn. Earlier, the solar arrays did a very similar maneuver. And before that, the flight director pulled the team here in Mission Control, and all were a go for today's burn. The key purpose of today's burn, besides checking out the OMS engine, is to correct any trajectory dispersions on this outbound leg of the mission. The outbound leg of the Artemis I mission is the portion between translunar injection, which occurred earlier today, and distant retrograde orbit insertion, which will take place a little later in the mission.
Flight Gene C.
And we did just hear that Orion is in the appropriate burn attitude. Everything continuing to proceed smoothly ahead of today's OTC-1 burn, 7 minutes and 30 seconds from now. We're now less than 6 minutes away from the OTC-1 burn, which will provide a critical checkout of the Orbital Maneuvering System engine, or OMS engine. It is located on the very bottom of the service module there. You see it on your screen there, located at the very bottom. It's the larger of those engines you see. Today's burn will last less than 30 seconds. Rather right around 30 seconds, but burns can occur with this engine that go up to 16 minutes in length. This OMS engine is the main engine on the European Service Module and is used to provide primary propulsion for Orion's major in-space maneuvers. The engine will provide about 6,000 pounds of thrust and is equipped to steer the spacecraft and can be used in some abort cases as well to safely return Orion to Earth. And this OMS engine is a repurposed Space Shuttle Orbital Maneuvering System engine that has flown in space before on 19 Space Shuttle flights from 1984 to 2002. We're now about 4 minutes and 30 seconds away from the start of today's burn. Less than 3 minutes until the start of today's OTC burn, which will provide a critical checkout of the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS engine, of the Orion spacecraft following its liftoff from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida 7 hours and 42 minutes ago. And as you see here, this mission elapsed time showing that Orion lifted off 7 hours and 43 minutes ago. Still in the beginning part of its journey, as this is a 25-day mission with a splashdown targeted for December 11th. But right now we're about a minute and 20 seconds away from the outbound trajectory correction burn, which again is a critical checkout of the Orbital Maneuvering System engine, or OMS engine. This burn is slated to last about 30 seconds, and everything is still go for today's burn. Less than a minute until the burn is underway. 30 seconds until burn starts. Burn is underway. Hearing good engine performance. And we are getting some imagery of the solar array on Orion as it maneuvers throughout this burn. And the burn has just wrapped up. That was a about 30-second long burn. And we did hear good calls from the team here in Mission Control, good performance from the orbital maneuvering system engine, the main engine on the European service module. Again, that burn was successful, all systems performing as expected, and a good checkout of the orbital maneuvering system engine, or OMS. Now, just a short time ago, Orion conducted the first trajectory adjustment burn and completed a checkout of the orbital maneuvering system, or OMS engine, and all went smoothly during that 30-second burn. Orion is continuing its journey to the moon, and we are anticipating views shortly as part of an imagery event. Now, as you can see on your screen, Orion is over 55,500 miles away from Earth, now 9 hours into its flight, but still 204,000 miles away from the moon. Of course, that distance will get less and less over the next few days, and at closest approach, Orion will be about 60 nautical miles above the surface of the moon. And we are starting to get some of our very first views of the Orion spacecraft. Great view right there in the center of your screen of that large engine, the orbital maneuvering system, or OMS engine, which just performed that orbital trajectory correction maneuver. Again, that all went smoothly. That OMS engine is the main engine and is a repurposed space shuttle orbital maneuvering system engine that has flown in space 19 times during space shuttle flights ranging from 1984 to 2002. And on the side of the Orion spacecraft, you also see some of the auxiliary engines on Orion. There's 8 of those auxiliary engines located on the bottom of the European service module in 4 sets of 2. These are fixed at the bottom to provide trajectory corrections and as a backup to that main engine, the OMS engine. Each of those auxiliary engines provide about 100 pounds of thrust. And there are also 24 smaller engines grouped into 6 pods on Orion, which provide attitude control. They can be fired individually as needed to move the spacecraft in different directions and rotate it into any position. So in total, the service module has We are now over 9 hours into the flight of Artemis I. Again, SLS launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida at 12:47 a.m. Central Time, 1:47 a.m. Eastern. Orion will be completing a 25-day mission as part of Artemis I with a splashdown slated for December 11th. Continuing to get some views of the orbital maneuvering system, or OMS engine, as well as those auxiliary engines. So as we continue to anticipate some additional views during this imagery event, these views will be gathered on cameras that Orion is equipped with. There's actually 3 different groups that fly on the vehicle itself. These include some internal cabin cameras that are, of course, inside Orion. And Orion is an uncrewed test flight, but when we do fly humans on board soon, these cameras will be capturing views of the crew inside Orion. And even though there isn't a crew inside Orion for this mission, we do have those internal cameras still on board to test out their capabilities. And there are also external cameras, and those cameras are mainly used for flight test objectives, or FTOs, in critical mission phases to check out how the vehicle is operating and performing. And then there's what we call external SAW cameras. The SAW camera is a solar array wing camera. Basically, the solar array wings are those X-shaped wings that stick out on the bottom of the Orion vehicle. We aren't getting imagery of that just yet, but we might hear shortly. These are used to collect solar power and distribute that to the vehicle itself. And then on the very edge of the solar array wings, there are the cameras, which are used to view different angles of the capsule itself. The SAW cameras can be rotated to get a different view and perspective from the camera. And on this graphic that you're seeing here on your screen, you can make out slightly the solar arrays, those black X-shaped figures there. And that is where those SAW cameras are located that we were just discussing. Orion is over 56,000 miles away from Earth, but still has about 204,000 miles in its journey to the moon. Again, this is a test flight of the Orion vehicle and its capabilities, resulting in a 25-day mission with splashdown on December 11th. the team here in Mission Control Houston continues to support, and here shortly the team will ensure that the SAW or solar array wing cameras are positioned correctly as we anticipate imagery here a short while from now. Now, this view of potentially Earth will be a little different than what we're used to seeing from the International Space Station, which orbits about 250 miles above Earth. Now, as just mentioned, Orion is currently over 50,000 miles away, so should be a pretty breathtaking image. Now, of course, throughout the coming days, we will expect to see the Earth grow smaller and smaller, and the Moon grow larger in the field of view as Orion approaches its destination. As Orion continues its journey towards the Moon, now over 9 hours since it launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, let's look at a broad overview of the Artemis mission to see what has happened so far and what is still to come.
Welcome to the moon board. We got this just in time for the first mission in Artemis, Artemis I, so let me use it now to take you through. As always, we're going to start off with a launch. In this case, 4 RS-25 engines ignite, 2 solid rocket boosters sending SLS and Orion skyward. On the way uphill, a couple of jettison events, things coming off of the rocket. One of the most visual will be these 2 solid rocket boosters coming off about 2 minutes into the flight after all of their propellant's gone. We also have 3 fairings protecting Orion on the way uphill, as well as the launch abort system that will come off. Now, after we get through all of the propellant in that giant core stage, we'll hear MECO, main engine cutoff. It will drop away, turning propulsion over to this, the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, or ICPS. It's going to make its first maneuver to raise up the lowest part of our orbit around the Earth, really put us in a nice circular path around our planet. And while we're in Earth orbit, we can check out Orion, make sure its systems are functioning as we expect before we commit to sending it to the Moon. That happens here, the trans-lunar injection, to a 20-minute firing of this ICPS upper stage. And what that's designed to do is really give Orion enough energy to get out of low Earth orbit and make its way to the Moon. Shortly after that, the ICPS will separate. Its job pushing Orion is done. It has a couple of secondary payloads in here, some CubeSats that it'll deploy, ultimately sending itself on a path around the Moon before it escapes and goes into orbit around the Sun. Meanwhile, Orion, though, continues on its journey. It'll make some correction burns as it fine-tunes its path towards our lunar neighbor before we get into all the exciting stuff up close. We'll dip in for a 60 nautical mile flyby of the lunar surface using the engines on the European Service Module to push us around and into distant retrograde orbit, or DRO. That's this dotted line that you can see up here. This is really where we're going to learn about Orion while we fly around the Moon, about 38,000 miles off the lunar surface. And we call it retrograde as the Moon is heading in that direction. Orion will be heading in this one, opposite retrograde. Now, after we're done in that orbit, it'll be time to come home. We'll execute a maneuver to exit, do another flyby close to the lunar surface that commits us to coming home and fine-tuning our path towards the atmosphere. We'll make any correction burns on our way back as necessary before it's time to re-enter the atmosphere. Now, before that can happen, we'll have a spacecraft separation event. The service module, its job is done. It breaks away, ends up burning up in the atmosphere after carrying Orion to the moon and back. What this does is reveal the heat shield, the large structure on the base of Orion. Testing this is our #1 goal for the Artemis I flight, because when we come back from the moon, we're going to be moving at 25,000 miles an hour. That's 8,000 miles an hour faster than when you come home from the International Space Station. And what that's going to cause is this to heat up to about 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's half the temperature if you were standing on the surface of the sun. So things will be very hot, but that heat shield does its job to protect the Orion capsule, which will be bringing our astronauts home at the end of these future missions. After we're through that fiery re-entry, parachutes deploy, Orion splashes down in the ocean. We'll have a U.S. Navy ship standing by with recovery personnel to pick Orion up out of the water and bring it in to the first flight in the Artemis program.
And if you're just tuning in with us, Orion launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida at 12:47 a.m. Central, 1:47 a.m. Eastern, and is on its way to the moon. Following translunar injection and the first orbital trajectory correction burn earlier this morning, Orion is now over 50,000 miles away from Earth, and we're beginning to see imagery from Orion, most notably of the large main engine on the European service module, the OMS, or Orbital Maneuvering System engine. We're also getting some views of the smaller auxiliary engines located to the left and the right of the OMS engine. There are 8 auxiliary engines in all on board Orion. Now again, that main engine that you're seeing, the largest engine, the Orbital Maneuvering System engine, was used just a short time ago to perform a burn that lasted about 30 seconds. All went smoothly during that burn. The engine can provide 6,000 pounds of thrust and is equipped to steer the spacecraft, and can also be used in some abort cases to safely return Orion to Earth. This engine that you see in the center, the module there, flew on 19 space shuttle flights, beginning with STS-41G in October of 1984 and ending with STS-112 in October of 2002. As Orion continues its journey to the moon, we do anticipate potential Earth views here in a short time. At this hour, now 9 hours and 19 minutes since launch, Orion is 57,000 miles away from Earth, closing in on the moon, 203,000 miles away. In this animation, you can see the SAW, or solar array wings, as they are being oriented in anticipation of this imagery event. So again, that SAW camera is a solar array wing camera. The solar arrays are that X-shaped wing that sticks out of the bottom of Orion that you can see on your screen there. They're used to collect solar power and distribute that to the vehicle itself. And on the very end of these wings are cameras which can capture different views of the capsule itself. Those wings can be rotated to gather different angles and viewpoints. The team here in Mission Control Houston is continuing to ensure that the solar arrays are positioned correctly for the upcoming imagery event. And again, in this shot, we're now seeing a slightly different angle of those auxiliary engines on the sides of the orbital maneuvering system engine. That's that larger engine right in the middle of the European service module. And we are actually seeing a little bit of movement in the solar array wings 2 and 3 in anticipation of the imagery event. Continuing to get a different perspective of Orion and the European service module as those solar array wings continue to move. As with nearly everything else during Artemis I, the two main objectives for the imagery system is to capture the flight test objective data and ensure we have a safe built vehicle for crew to fly on. Really starting to be able to make out that solar array wing now in the bottom left, now more middle of your screen. And you're seeing there on your screen our first Earth views. This view of Earth captured from a human-rated spacecraft not seen since 1972 during the final Apollo mission some 50 years ago. The views of our blue marble in the blackness of space now capturing the imagination of a new generation, the Artemis generation. Orion looking back at Earth as it travels toward the moon 57,000 miles away from the place we call home. And as we continue to marvel in this spectacular image here in Mission Control Houston, you have a great view of the Orbital Maneuvering System, or OMS engine, that main engine on the top left of your screen there that was used an hour and 43 minutes ago to perform the OTC, or outbound trajectory correction maneuver, as well as a few of the auxiliary engines on the bottom of the European service module, flanked by the solar array wing on the right portion, right above the Earth on your screen. And here are some statistics on Orion, now 57,000 miles away from Earth, nearly 58,000 miles away, and 203,000 miles away from the moon, traveling at 5,459 miles per hour. If you're just tuning in with us, you're looking at a breathtaking live view of the Earth from the Orion spacecraft as it makes its journey to the moon. Orion launched earlier today at 12:47 a.m. Central, 1:47 a.m. Eastern, atop the Space Launch System, and is in hour 9.5 of its 25-day test flight mission. We are continuing to get these views of Earth from the solar array wing camera. The solar array wing can be seen there in the center of your screen, that rectangular shaped object. Orion is now over 58,000 miles away from Earth. And you can see there the X-shaped figures on your screen. Those are the solar array wings themselves, which were where the camera views we were getting were from. And this view from inside the Orion vehicle. This is a uncrewed test flight, but on the left of your screen there, we do have one of our purposeful passengers, our Moonikin, who is wearing the Orion Crew Survival spacesuit. This will be the spacesuit that will be utilized by astronauts when they launch to the moon on Artemis II. On the right of your screen there, you can see one of the windows that our crew members will have the opportunity to look out from once they make their journey to the moon. Again, if you're just joining us, you're looking at an in-cabin view of the uncrewed Orion vehicle. On the left of the screen, there is one of our purposeful passengers wearing the Orion Crew Survival suit that will be utilized and worn by astronauts during the dynamic phases of flight to the moon. As this is a test mission, while all of the components of Orion and the Space Launch System are being tested, the Orion Crew Survival suit is now having the opportunity to be tested in space as well. We're continuing to get in-cabin views inside the Orion spacecraft. Orion lifted off from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida 9.5 hours ago as part of a 25-day test flight around the moon and into deep space. Orion is slated to splash down on December 11th. Again, this is a uncrewed test flight, but we do have our Moonikin pictured there on the left of your screen in the seat. They're wearing the Orion crew survival suit. This is the spacesuit that will be worn by our crew members when they fly inside Orion during dynamic phases of flight. As you can see there, the suit itself is that bright orange color. That is to help make crew members more easily visible in the ocean should they ever need to exit Orion without the assistance of recovery personnel. The spacesuit is also fire resistant and is a pressure garment that includes a restraint layer to control the shape and to ease astronauts' movement while suited up. The suit also has a thermal management system to help keep astronauts cool and dry, and a liquid cooling garment that's worn underneath the suit. The Orion suits will be custom fitted for each crew member to accommodate astronauts of all sizes. And the gloves will be touchscreen compatible to work alongside the systems inside Orion. The Orion crew survival suit is primarily designed for launch and re-entry, but can also keep astronauts safe if Orion were to lose cabin pressure during the journey to the moon. Astronauts could survive inside this spacesuit for up to 6 days as they make their way back to Earth if necessary. And the suits are also equipped with a suite of survival gear in the event that, again, they have to exit Orion after a splashdown. And as we've mentioned, Artemis I is an uncrewed test flight of the Space Launch System and the Orion vehicle. So the Moonikin you see on the left of your screen there does not have a human inside of it, but it does actually have a name. The Moonikin's name is Campos and is dedicated to Arturo Campos, who was a key player in bringing Apollo 13 safely back to Earth. The Moonikin received its name as the result of a competitive bracket contest honoring some of NASA's key figures, programs, and astronomical objects. NASA received more than 300,000 votes, and the winner was Arturo Campos. And with the first live imagery views of Earth from Orion, that will wrap up our coverage for today. But we'll continue to post daily updates about the mission on the Artemis blog at blogs.nasa.gov/Artemis, and we'll also be posting updates on our social media accounts. We'll be back on the air on Monday to cover the outbound powered flyby burn, at which point we will witness Orion's closest approach to the moon, which will be approximately 80 nautical miles. Our coverage will begin at 6:15 a.m. Central, 7:15 a.m. Eastern, with a burn targeted at 6:43 a.m. Central, 7:43 a.m. Eastern, and closest approach occurring at 6:57 a.m. Central, 7:57 a.m. Eastern. Again, when we're not live, you can check out the blog for updates and also subscribe to the NASA newsletter for updates on the spacecraft and mission. And we're also excited to introduce Artemis All Access, which is a short video product released 2 to 3 times weekly that will provide updates about mission accomplishments with a look at what's to come. Plus, we'll have inside looks and explainers. But for now, with Orion continuing its journey to our nearest celestial neighbor, the moon, that will wrap up our coverage for today. Thanks so much for watching us. This is Mission Control Houston.